Hello everyone, Brad from the PDH Pod here with Game 1 of the Casual Pauper Commander stream from December 2nd, 2023. Before we get to the game, use the buttons below to like, subscribe, and tune in to the PDH Pod podcast every Friday morning for more Pauper Commander talk. With that out of the way, let's introduce tonight's commanders. First up, we've got Abby at Common Commander on Twitter, playing Arwen, Undamil, I don't know how to say that, the green and a blue 2/2 legendary creature Elf Noble with the ability, whenever you scry, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature, and for 4 generic, a blue and a green, you can scry 2 at instant speed. Next up, we've got Max at Maximum Magic on Twitter, playing Wilson Refined Grizzly. Wilson is a 2-mana bear, legendary creature bear, that says this spell can't be countered. It has Vigilance, Reach, and Trample. It has Ward 2, and it also has Choose a Background. Max is playing the background of Agent of the Iron Throne. It's a legendary enchantment background that says commander creatures you own have, whenever an artifact or creature you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, each opponent loses 1 life. Next up, we have Dax at Dax Goes Face on X/Twitter, playing Akawallie the Seething Tower. It's a generic, a green and a black for a legendary creature Fungus. It's a 3/3 with Descend 4. As long as there are 4 or more permanent cards in your graveyard, Akawallie the Seething Tower gets +2/+2 and has Trample. It also has Descend 8. As long as there are 8 or more permanent cards in your graveyard, Akawallie gets an additional +2/+2 and cannot be blocked by more than 1 creature. And then we got me playing the Mouth of Sauron, a legendary human advisor 3/4 for 3 generic, a blue, and a black that says, when the Mouth of Sauron enters the battlefield, target player mills 3 cards, then amass Orcs X, where X is the number of instant and sorcery cards in that player's graveyard. All 4 players resolve their mulligans, and we're on to turn 1. Abby draws and starts the game with an island and passes. Max draws and plays a Woodland Chasm. Dax draws, plays a swamp, and passes. I draw for turn, drop a command tower, then cast Preordain, put both cards back on top, then draw a card. Abby draws for turn, plays a forest, then her commander, Arwen. Max draws, plays a swamp and his commander, Wilson, then passes the turn. Dax draws, plays a forest, casts a Sylvan Ranger, grabs a forest from his library, and passes. I untap and draw a card. I play a Mistvault Bridge, then cast Hard Evidence, which makes a 0/3 crab token. I pass the turn. Abby draws, plays an island for turn, then she casts Augury Owl for turn. Arwen's ability triggers, and Abby puts the +1/+1 counter on the owl. After scrying 1 to the top and 2 to the bottom, she moves to combat and swings Arwen at Dax, who blocks with the Ranger. The Ranger dies, and this adds 1 permanent to Dax's graveyard, which will be relevant later. Passes the turn to Max. Max draws for turn and plays a forest. He moves to combat and sends Wilson at Dax's face, then taps out to play Master Chef. He passes the turn after that. Dax draws for turn. He plays a forest, then taps 2 to play Blanchwood Prowler, which mills him for 3 on ETB. He puts a swamp into his hand from among the milled cards. His graveyard is up to 2 permanents now. He passes to me with 7 cards in hand. I draw for turn and play an island, then play a Wedding Invitation, which draws me a card. With nothing else to do, I pass the turn to Abby. Abby draws for turn, drops an island, and plays Wingcrafter, which ETBs and soul bonds to Arwen to give her flying. Abby taps 3 to play Arwen's Gift to scry 2 and draw 2. In response, Max casts Snuff Out, targeting Abby's commander. Arwen's ability doesn't resolve, so Abby does not get to put a +1/+1 counter on a creature. She scries 1 to the top and 1 to the bottom, then draws 2 cards. Abby moves to combat and swings at Max with Augury Owl. Max doesn't block and takes 2 damage. Abby passes. Max draws for turn, plays a swamp, then casts Etched Familiar, which gets a +1/+1 counter from Master Chef. Max moves to combat and sends the Crackback at Abby with Wilson. Abby takes 2 commander damage. In his second main phase, Max casts an Executioner's Capsule and passes. On his end step, Dax casts a Corrupted Conviction, sacrificing the Prowler to draw 2 cards. His graveyard permanent count rises to 3. Dax starts his turn. He plays a swamp, then taps 1 of each color to cast a Basilicus creature. Next, he taps his remaining lands to put out a Bloodseeker into play. After that, he passes the turn. I draw for turn, play another island, and with 6 cards in hand and nothing really to play, I pass it over to Abby. Abby draws, then plays an island. She taps 3 for a Moonfolk Puzzle Maker. She loses a life to Bloodseeker. Abby taps 2 for Over the Edge, using the mode of Destroy an Enchantment to blow up Master Chef. Abby moves to combat and swings the 2/2 Owl at Dax and the Wingcrafter at me. Dax takes 2, and I block with my crab token. Abby passes the turn after attacking. Max draws for turn, then plays a Dredge Recycler. Bloodseeker triggers, and Max loses a life. He moves to combat and swings the Etched Familiar at Abby, and Wilson heads towards Dax. Neither of them block. Max passes after that. Dax draws for turn. He plays a Forest, then taps 4 to play his Commander, paying the extra 1 for Screecher's Extort ability. His opponents lose 1 life each, and Dax gains 3. Not wanting to lose his creatures in combat, Dax moves to pass the turn, but on his end step, I tap 2 for Winds of Rebuke, targeting Etched Familiar and milling everyone for 2. This puts Dax's bin up to 4 permanents, which makes Akawallie a 5/5 with Trample. I begin my turn. I play another island and tap out to play my commander, Mr. Mouth. I target myself with the mill and put a 7/7 Orc army into play. Bloodseeker triggers twice, and I lose 2 life. Doing all that took everything I had, so I pass it to Abby. Abby plays another island and recasts her commander, losing a life to Bloodseeker, and soul bonds Arwen to Wingcrafter to give it flying. She then moves to combat and attacks Brad with the Puzzle Maker, with triggers to scry 1, which in turn triggers Arwen. She puts the scried card back on top and the +1 counter on her commander. Abby passes the turn, but Max responds with a Go for the Throat, targeting the Basilicus creature. Max draws for turn, but it's not a land. He recasts Etched Familiar, losing a life to Bloodseeker, then just passes the turn. Dax untaps and draws a card to start his turn. He cycles a Nurturing Bristleback to go get a Forest. This puts his graveyard at 6 permanents. He plays the Tutored Forest for turn, then taps 2 for Tithing Blade, which makes each of his opponents sacrifice a creature. I sack my Crab, Abby sacks her Owl, and Max sacrifices his Etched Familiar, which makes his opponents lose 2 life, and he gains 2. After Tithing Blade resolves, Max targets my Orc army with Tragic Slip. Big sad. Dax moves to combat and sends his Trampling Commander north. Max doesn't block and takes 5 commander damage. Dax passes the turn. I draw for my turn, play a Swamp, and tap 3 for Candlekeep Sage. That's all for me. Take it away, Abby. At the end of my turn, Abby flashes in an Omen of the Sea, which scries 1 to the bottom and 1 to the top. Arwen triggers to put a +1 counter on herself. Abby untaps and draws, then casts an Arakocra Sneak to introduce the initiative to the game. She finds her second Forest, which she plays for turn. Moving to combat, she attacks me with the Puzzle Maker, scrying 1 when it becomes tapped. Abby scries to the bottom. Arwen triggers to put another counter on herself. I take 1 damage. Abby is reminded to lose a life due to Bloodseeker for putting the Sneak into play, and then she passes the turn. Max draws and moves directly to combat, striking a deal to get the initiative from Abby for 2 Wilson damage so long as he doesn't kill Arwen with his Executioner's Capsule. Max enters the Undercity and tutors up a snow-covered forest, which he plays for turn. Second main phase, Max plays his background, Agent of the Iron Throne, then passes the turn. Dax untaps and draws for turn. He taps 3 for Parasitic Impetus, targeting Arwen. Dax then plays a Hunter's Maze for turn and moves to combat. He attacks Max with Akawallie. Max doesn't block, so he takes another 5 commander damage, and Dax gets the initiative, entering the Undercity to fetch a basic forest. He passes the turn over to me. I draw for turn, play an island, and move straight to combat, swinging at Dax with Mr. Mouth. Dax doesn't block, so he takes 3 commander damage. I get the initiative, putting a swamp into my hand. Second main phase, I pay 4 for Surrounded by Orcs, which amasses an Orc army of 3, and I target myself with its mill ability, also for 3. I also lose a life to Bloodseeker. With 4 cards in hand, I pass the turn to Abby. At the end of my turn, Abby cracks her Omen of the Sea to scry 2, triggering Arwen to put a +1/+1 counter on Arakocra Sneak. Abby begins her turn and draws. She moves right to combat, attacking Brad with a 7/7 Arwen, and Dax with the Puzzle Maker, which scries 1 to trigger Arwen again. Abby puts the +1 counter on the Sneak. Dax takes the damage from Puzzle Maker, but gains 2 life from Parasitic Impetus. Before damage, Brad casts Deceive the Messenger, which gives Arwen -3/-0 and amasses Orcs 1. I can't block, so I take 4 commander damage. Abby regains the initiative, moving into the next room to scry 2, which again triggers Arwen. She puts both cards on the bottom and puts another counter on the Sneak. Post-combat, Abby plays a Tangled Islet, casts a Goggles of Night, then passes the turn. At end of turn, Max cycles an Ash Barrens to get Swamp into his hand. Max draws for turn and plays that Swamp. He cracks Executioner's Capsule to destroy Arakocra Sneak. Iron Throne triggers and Max's opponents each lose a life. Max then casts a Demon's Disciple. Abby sacks Wingcrafter, Dax sacks Bloodseeker. In response to Demon's Disciple ETB effect, I cast Demonic Gifts, targeting my commander, which gives it +2/+0, and when it dies, return it to the battlefield under its owner's control, and then I sacrifice it. Looks like I forgot the Mouth of Sauron mill trigger, but I do amass orcs for an additional 12 +1/+1 counters. Candlekeep Sage also triggers twice, so I draw 2 cards. Dax's graveyard is up to 7 permanents. Max moves to combat, successfully regaining the initiative from Abby. He ventures into the next room and scries 2, and then he passes the turn. Dax draws for turn. He plays a swamp, then taps 2 for Nasty End, targeting his commander. It resolves and he draws 3. He then taps 4 for a Dread Return to reanimate Akawallie. With that, he passes the turn. I untap and draw for turn, then play a Dismal Backwater, gaining 1 life. Then tap 2 for a Coastal Bulwark. At the beginning of the combat step, I sacrifice Wedding Invitation to make my orc army unblockable and swing at Dax for 16 damage. Dax casts a Moment's Peace, and in response, I dispel it. Dax doesn't block, so he takes the full army power. I pass the turn to Abby after that. At the end of turn, she casts a Contact Other Plane and rolls an 18, scrying 2 and drawing 2 cards, which also triggers Arwen. Abby puts a +1/+1 counter on the Puzzle Maker. Abby draws for turn. She taps 6 mana for Cavern Stomper, which ETBs and scries 2. Arwen triggers and puts a counter on the Stomper. Abby moves to combat, sending Arwen at me and the Puzzle Maker at max for the initiative. Puzzle Maker scries, which triggers Arwen to put another counter on the Stomper. Before combat damage and being desperate for card draw, I cast Zalfirin's Shapecraft, targeting the Puzzle Maker to give it a base power and toughness 4/3, and it draws me a card. Max can't block the flyer, so he takes 5 and I take 7 commander damage from Arwen, which puts me at 11. Abby regains the initiative, choosing to goad my orc army. Abby passes the turn, leaving up only her dinosaur and a dream. Max untaps and draws for turn. He plays a swamp and casts Ashnod's Altar. Then, also being desperate for cards, he casts Costly Plunder, sacrificing the altar to draw 2. Iron Throne triggers, so his opponents each lose 1 life. Having no profitable attacks, Max passes the turn. Dax draws for turn. He sacrifices the Hunter's Maze to draw a card and put his graveyard permanent count up to 8, making his commander a 7/7. He casts an Eye Collector. He then moves to combat and sends his commander at max. Max can only block it with 1 creature, so he takes 5 damage from the Seething Tower. When Max's blocking creature dies, the Iron Throne triggers and his opponents each lose a life. Second main phase, Dax plays a Sanitarium Skeleton, then plays a Witch's Cottage, which comes in untapped and puts the Bristleback back on top of his library. Dax accidentally only pays 3 to cast a Siphon Mind, causing each of his opponents to discard a card, so he draws 3. Dax passes after that. At the end of turn, I Surveil with the Bulwark and put Counterspell into my graveyard. I untap and draw for turn. I play an island, then cast Echoing Truth, targeting the Mouth. It's returned to my hand, which triggers Candlekeep Sage, draw me a card. I recast a Mouth, drawing off Candlekeep again, and targeting myself with the Mouth's Mill ability. His ability resolves and puts 18 more +1/+1 counters on my orc army to make it a 34/34 with no evasion. #winning. Because of goad, I have to attack, so I move to combat and swing at Dax with the orc. He chump blocks with the skeleton. I then pass my turn to Abby. Abby untaps and draws for turn. She progresses through the Undercity to draw a card, then taps 3 to cast a Pride Malkin, which puts a +1/+1 counter onto Arwen and gives trample to all her creatures with a +1/+1 counter on them. Abby spends 4 mana to make the Stomper unblockable by creatures that have 2 or less power. She moves to combat, sending the Stomper at Dax, Arwen at me, and the Puzzle Maker at max. The Puzzle Maker scries, triggering her commander to put another counter on Arwen. Upon Arwen's attack, Abby loses 2 life to the Impetus, and Dax gains 2 life, but it's not enough. Dax and Brad are destroyed. Abby passes the turn. Max untaps for his final turn. He doesn't draw anything to save himself, so he simply concedes to Abby's board state. Congrats on the win, Abby! Thanks to everyone who stayed until the end of the game. Check out the links in the description below, and now go play some PDH. Peace.